Today we'll be looking at the question, should you worship an evil god? Mostly, I just find this to be an interesting philosophical issue, but I mean, hey, maybe you're an atheist who thinks that the Christian God is evil, so this video is relevant to you for that reason. I mean, I'd obviously argue the Christian God isn't evil, but setting that aside. Anyways, by the question, should you worship an evil god, I'm not assuming that there is in fact an evil god. What I mean is, if an evil god existed, should you worship it? Now, a statement in the form, if A were true, would B be true, is pretty straightforward to analyze. Instead of looking at the actual world that we live in, we study a hypothetical world where A is true. Then we just look inside of it to see if B is also true. So instead of looking at the actual world, we look at a hypothetical world where there's an evil god, and look to see if you should worship it. But now we run into a complication. God is usually defined in such a way that he's tightly linked to morality. So if in this hypothetical world, God is really different and weird, then morality is also going to be really different and weird too. To differentiate things, I'm going to creatively call the morality in the actual world morality X, and the morality in this hypothetical evil god world morality Y. So now there are two moralities on the table. But our original question includes words that are defined in terms of morality. The word should here is about what's in accordance with morality. The word evil means something opposed to morality. And finally, God is a being who is, among other things, morally perfect. But is any given instance of the word morality referring to morality X or morality Y? Well, there's nothing saying we can't mix and match, so that gives us a total of 8 different ways of interpreting our original question. Is it in accordance with morality blank to worship a being who is bad according to morality blank, but is perfect according to morality blank? We have XXX, XXY, XYX, and so on. Now that we're being clear with the meaning of our words, it's super easy to go through and answer each interpretation of this question, so let's do that. First, notice in this interpretation we have morality X in the 2 right columns. This would require God to be both in alignment with and not be in alignment with the same moral standard. That's impossible, so this interpretation of the question is incoherent. These 3 interpretations here also run into the same problem, so they're also incoherent. Moving on, I'm going to make the assumption that it is always in accordance with morality to worship a morally perfect being. This is always true if the 2 moral standards being referenced are the same. One could debate the truth of this principle, but that's beyond the scope of this video. This principle tells us that, with these 2 interpretations of our question, the answer is yes, we should worship. I'm going to also similarly assume that it is never in accordance with morality to worship a morally bad being. Once again, the 2 moral standards referenced must be the same. This tells us that with the final 2 interpretations of our question, the answer is no, we shouldn't worship. Now we've thoroughly analyzed the available interpretations of this question. But what this list is telling us isn't very clear. I mean, that's just a long, complicated list. So I'll illustrate it with 2 scenarios, because our list showed that there are 2 interpretations of what it means for God to be evil. I'm also going to use love as a stand-in for something obviously moral according to actual world morality. So without further ado, imagine a hypothetical world where there is a God who lines up with actual world morality perfectly, so he's loving and stuff. But in this hypothetical world, morality is really messed up. In this world, morality tells you to not be loving. And since this God doesn't line up with this world's morality, God is evil in this world. Now if you ask a person in the actual world, should you worship that God? They'll say, of course, he's so loving and moral and stuff. But if you ask people in that hypothetical world the same question, they'll say, of course not, this God doesn't line up with our morality at all, so it would be immoral to worship him. The second scenario is like the first, except that the God in this hypothetical world is unloving and hateful or whatever, so he matches the morality of his own hypothetical world rather than the actual world. Now, people in the actual world will say, whoa, that being over there is immoral, let's not worship him. But people in the hypothetical world would say, this God lines up with our morality perfectly, so our morality tells us to worship him. Now that we've gone over all that, we can figure out what to do if you ever happen to learn that an evil God exists. First, let's talk in general terms about updating our moral beliefs. Say you believe that morality tells you to do X, but some hypothetical morality tells you to do Y. You'll of course try to do X and not care about Y, because who cares about what hypothetical moralities say? But if you learn that you're mistaken, and the world which you thought was hypothetical is in reality the actual world you live in, and the other world is just hypothetical, then the correct response is to change your actions and start doing Y. It's silly to keep doing X because you're only gaining the approval of a hypothetical morality. So if you ever learn that the hypothetical evil God from the second scenario isn't hypothetical but actually exists, the correct response is to worship this God, because that's what morality tells you to do. And morality is kind of an authority on what you're supposed to do. That's really annoying, but the only alternative is to refrain from worshipping God on the basis of some hypothetical imaginary moral standard. On the other hand, if you ever learn that the hypothetical evil God from the first scenario isn't hypothetical but actually exists, the correct response is to not worship him, because that's what morality tells you to do. This should also really be annoying because that God looks so worshipable. But no, morality tells us otherwise. So, in the end, the correct answer to should you worship an evil God is annoying for both the atheist and the theist alike. But, doesn't that make sense? We're imagining what would happen if an evil God existed, for crying out loud. We should be annoyed if we ran into something like that. Anyways, that's the end of this video. Hopefully, it also helped give a framework to go about answering other interpretations of the should you worship an evil God question, because there are arguably many other ways to think about it that could be explored. With that said, thank you for watching. Please subscribe and support me on Patreon if you enjoy this content.